Silas Blackwell didn't even look up from his desk when he signed the arrest warrant. That was the part that stayed with people afterward, not the accusation itself, not the forged signature on the theft report, not even the way he'd had her dragged from the boarding house in front of everyone on Main Street while she was still in her nightgown. It was the fact that he signed her life away the same way he signed a feed invoice. Bored, unhurried, like ruining a woman was just another item on his morning list. Make sure she doesn't talk to anyone before the transfer, he told the sheriff, still not looking up. Anyone who listens to her is going to have a very difficult season. Mara Whitlock had worked 3 years for that man. 3 years of keeping his books clean, his numbers straight, his lies perfectly organized. And that was exactly why he needed her gone. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and follow Mara's story all the way to the end, because what happens next is the kind of thing most people never see coming. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really began. The sound came at midnight, not a knock, not a voice calling out, just a single heavy thud against the front door of Everett Callahan's ranch house, like something had fallen against it and didn't have the strength to try again. Everett was already awake. He'd been awake for an hour, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, doing the thing he did most nights when the silence got too heavy for staring at nothing, and waiting for morning to rescue him from it. 11 years of that particular biba had made him good at recognizing the difference between sounds that belonged to the night and sounds that didn't. That thud didn't belong. He didn't move for almost a full minute. His rifle was leaning against the wall near the back door, which told you something about how his mind worked. He'd learned long ago that whatever came through a back door was usually more dangerous than whatever came through the front. He crossed to the window first, pulled the curtain back an inch, and looked at the road. Nothing. No lantern light moving down the track, no horses tied at the post. Just the pale dirt road running away into darkness, and the wind moving through the dry grass on either side of it. He picked up the rifle anyway. When he opened the front door, the woman nearly fell inside. She was on her knees on the porch, both hands pressed flat against the doorframe, holding herself up through what looked like sheer stubborn refusal to collapse completely. One boot on, one foot bare, a dress that had been torn along the hem and the left shoulder, hairs loose and tangled with what might have been dried mud or dried blood in the dark. It was hard to tell. Her face was turned up toward him, and even in the poor light from the kitchen window, he could see that one side of it was swollen, the skin darkening along her cheekbone, in the way that meant someone's fist had been there recently. She looked at the rifle. She looked at his face. And then in a voice so stripped down and used up it barely qualified as a whisper, she said, "Please, don't send me back." Everett stood there for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. 11 years of opening this door to no one. 11 years of keeping the world exactly as far away as he wanted it. He looked at the road again, then back at her, and made a decision that he suspected was going to complicate his life considerably. "Can you stand up?" he asked. She tried. She got one foot under herself, the booted one, and pushed, and made it about halfway before her arms started shaking. Everett caught her elbow before she went down sideways. She was not a small woman. He felt her full weight shift against him for just a moment before she steadied, and he noticed that she flinched when he touched her left side. Ribs, he thought. At least one, inside, he said. Not a question. He got her through the door and onto the old settee near the fireplace, and then he went back to the porch, looked at the road for another long moment, and closed the door. He set the rifle against the wall where he could reach it and added 2 logs to the banked embers in the fireplace. Not because the room was particularly cold, but because she was shaking and firelight would let him see her better. She watched him do all of this without speaking. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers laced together, and he recognized that posture. It was the posture of someone working very hard to appear calm, because calm was the only thing standing between them and falling completely apart. "You want water?" he said. "Yes, a beet." "Please." He brought her a cup and then sat down in the chair across from her, not close enough to crowd her, and waited. He'd learned from years of dealing with frightened animals and exhausted ranch hands that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was simply be quiet. She drank half the water in one long swallow and then held the cup in both hands and stared at the fire. "I'm not a thief," she said finally. "Didn't say you were. You were thinking it." "I was thinking you've got a broken rib." maybe 2, and you've been running on that bare foot long enough to cut it up pretty good. Beyond that, I haven't decided anything." She looked at him then, really looked at him, like she was trying to calculate something. He met her eyes and didn't look away. Whatever she was calculating, she seemed to reach an answer, because some of the rigid tension in her shoulders shifted down by a fraction. "My name is Mara Whitlock," she said. "I worked for Silas Blackwell. I kept his books for 3 years." Everett knew the name Blackwell, the way everyone in the territory knew it, the same way you knew the names of rivers that had flooded before. Something to be aware of, something to give space to. He hadn't had personal dealings with the man, but he'd heard enough. He kept his face neutral and let her continue. 6 days ago, he called me into his office and told me there was money missing from the accounts. She stopped, pressed her lips together. He had a letter. He said it was in my handwriting. An authorization to transfer funds. $240. Her jaw tightened. I've never written that letter. I've never taken a dollar that wasn't my salary. But he had the letter. His handwriting looks like mine. We've worked together for 3 years. He's seen enough of my correspondence, my account notes, everything. He had time to practice. She looked down at her hands. The sheriff came the same afternoon. Blackwell didn't even let me go back to my room for my coat. "So how are you here?" And not in a jail cell. For the first time, something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but close. The look of someone who'd managed one small victory inside a very bad situation. The deputy who was supposed to lock my cell was Chet Dunning. His brother owes me a favor. I helped his family with some paperwork when they nearly lost their claim 2 years ago. Chet looked the other way for 4 minutes. She paused. I made those 4 minutes count. That was 2 days ago? 3. I've been moving at night. Everett looked at her bare foot, at the dark staining on the sole where the cuts had dried, and thought about 3 nights of walking in the dark. He stood up. "I'm going to get some clean cloth and the iodine," he said. "While I do that, you think about whether there's anyone Blackwell would send after you who knows this part of the territory." She was quiet for a moment. "His man Greer, Webb Greer. He grew up in the valley south of here." She hesitated. "He's not a good person. Most people Blackwell keeps close aren't." He moved toward the back hallway and stopped. "There's a bolt on that door. I'm going to watch the road from the upstairs window for a while before I sleep. You should be able to get a few hours." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name, somewhere between wariness and something rawer than that. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You don't know me." Everett thought about it honestly, which was more than the question probably expected. "Because you didn't ask me to believe you," he said. "You asked me not to send you back. That's a different thing." He looked at her steadily. "And because whoever put that bruise on your face didn't do it in a fair fight." He left her there by the fire and went to find the iodine. He stayed up until nearly 4 in the morning, watching the road from the window of the upstairs bedroom that hadn't been used for 11 years. Nothing moved on it. The wind came and went. Around 3:30, a coyote crossed the far end of the track and paused to look at the house, and Everett watched it move on into the dark field. When he came downstairs at first light, Mara was still on the settee. She'd pulled the old wool blanket from the back of it over herself and fallen asleep sitting mostly upright, her head dropped to one side, the empty water cup still in one hand. She looked younger asleep than she had awake, and younger than he'd first estimated, not much past her late 20s, maybe 30 at the outside, which meant she'd gone to work for Blackwell when she was barely more than a girl. He made coffee and started on breakfast, moving quietly. She woke up to the smell of it, sat up sharply with the immediate alertness of someone who'd spent the last 3 nights not sleeping safely. And for just a second, her eyes swept the room the way an animal sweeps a new space, checking exits, checking threats. Then she saw him at the stove, and something in her settled. "Coffee?" he said. "Yes." She pushed the blanket back and winced when she moved her left side. "Thank you." He poured 2 cups and put a plate of eggs and bread on the table. She came to it slowly, favoring her right side, and sat down. They ate mostly in silence, which suited them both, it seemed. "I need to tell you the rest of it," she said, when the plate was mostly clear. "Not just about me, about what I found in those books. I figured there was more. Blackwell's been doing this for years, not just to me." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "The money he accused me of taking, that's the small version of what he does. He manufactures debt. He forges loan defaults, creates records that say families owe money they never borrowed, and then he uses those records to seize property through the county court. She looked up at him. He's been doing it to small ranches, farm families, people who don't have lawyers and don't know what they're looking at when they see the paperwork. Everett set his cup down. I found 3 sets of forged default notices in the past year alone, she continued. The Peterson family lost their eastern pasture in February. The Halloran, placed the old one on the creek, was transferred to a land trust in March. I kept notes, in a ledger I kept at my boarding house. Separate from Blackwell's books. My own record of what I was seeing, she paused. That's the other reason he needed me arrested and discredited. It wasn't just that I might talk. It's that I can prove it. Your ledger, Everett said. It's still at the boarding house. Yes. Blackwell knows about it? He doesn't know it exists. But if he searches my room, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Everett stood up and took both plates to the basin. He stood there for a moment with his back to her, thinking. I've got a man who rides into town on Tuesdays for feed, he said. That's tomorrow. I can have him look in on the boarding house, see if there's been any activity. I don't want to bring trouble to someone who doesn't know what they're walking into. I'll tell him enough. He's been with me 12 years. He turned around. In the meantime, you're going to need somewhere to be that isn't the parlor. I've got a full season of account records that need organizing, bought 3 additional head of cattle in March, and my books are a mess. It's actual work, not something I'm inventing. She looked at him steadily. You're not offering me charity. No. I'm offering you a job. Room and board plus wages. Same as I'd pay anyone with your skills. He met her gaze. You can say no. She was quiet for a long moment. He noticed she did, that went very still when she was thinking, not performing consideration but actually doing it, turning a thing over and looking at all its sides. I'm not going to be easy to have around, she said finally. I ask a lot of questions. I work alone. I don't ask enough. Something almost like a smile. All right, she said. I'll look at your books. His records were, as promised, a genuine disaster, not from dishonesty, but from the particular kind of negligence that came from a man who knew exactly what he had and couldn't see the point in writing it all down. 3 years of receipts stuffed into an old coffee tin. Breeding records kept in the margins of a 1,871 almanac. A deed box that held the ranch's property documents, an old photograph, and what appeared to be several letters never sent, and a broken pocket watch. Mara sat at the kitchen table that first afternoon with the coffee tin and the almanac and a stack of blank paper and began sorting. She didn't ask for help and didn't seem to need it. Everett came through periodically to check on things and found her working in silence, so focused. It was almost audible, not the silence of someone waiting, but the silence of someone fully occupied. By late afternoon, she had 3 organized piles, a column of figures that actually added up, and a question. You're missing a section of your eastern boundary line, she said, when he came in for coffee. He stopped. What? Here, she turned a paper toward him, one of the property documents from the deed box. This is your original land grant. 380 acres. She placed a second document beside it, something handwritten. This is what was filed with the county last spring. 340. Everett came to the table and looked at both documents. His jaw tightened. I didn't file that, I know, her voice was careful. The handwriting on the county form isn't yours. I've been looking at your account notes all afternoon. I know what your writing looks like. This isn't it. He picked up the county document and looked at it for a long time. The paper felt ordinary in his hands, just paper, just ink. But the 40 acres it had erased, he knew exactly which 40 acres those were. The eastern meadow, the spring-fed pasture where his cattle spent most of August. Blackwell, he said. I think so. The same land trust name that appears in his other transfers, Meridian Land Trust. It's on the bottom of this form. Everett put the document down very carefully, the way you put something down when you're making a deliberate choice not to throw it. He's been setting this up, Mara said quietly. The boundary adjustment comes first. Then, when he's ready, he manufactures a debt, files the default, and the county clerk processes a transfer. By the time you realize what's happened, it's already recorded, and you're fighting records, not a person. How long has he been doing this? Years. Longer than I worked for him, I think. She paused. I was helping him do it. I didn't know. I thought I was keeping clean books. Her voice didn't crack, but it came close. I thought everything I was recording was legitimate. Everett looked at her. She was staring at the documents, and there was something in her face, not quite guilt, but close enough to it. The look of someone reckoning with the distance between what they'd believed and what had actually been happening. You didn't know, he said. That doesn't fix it. No. But it's still true. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Tell me about Meridian Land Trust. What do you know? And she told him. She talked for 2 hours, systematically, the way she organized figures starting with what she knew for certain, then what she suspected, then what she had seen but couldn't yet explain. Everett listened without interrupting, which was the thing he was actually good at when he put his mind to it. By the time she finished, the light outside had changed from afternoon yellow to early evening gold, and Everett had filled 3 pages of his own rough notes. You said you kept your own ledger, he said, separate from his. Yes. How complete is it? It covers 8 months of what I noticed. Names, dates, amounts, property descriptions. I wrote down everything that looked wrong as I found it, including the ones I couldn't fully explain. She looked at him directly. It's enough to build a case. If someone with authority wanted to build one, we need that ledger. She let the word sit there for a moment. Unless you're planning to do this alone, Everett said. I'm open to that. I'm also missing 40 acres. She looked at him for another of those long, still moments. It's in the lining of my traveling case, she said. Under the bed at the boarding house. Room 6. My man Holt goes to town tomorrow morning. He folded his rough notes. I'll tell him exactly what to look for. If Blackwell's people are watching the boarding house, Holt's been in this territory his whole life. He knows how to move without being noticed. Everett stood up. Eat something. Then sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day either way, and you haven't done enough of either in the last 3 days. She started to say something he could see it, and then she didn't. She just nodded. He went to see about dinner, and she went back to his property records. Because apparently that was how Mara Whitlock handled uncertainty. She found the nearest set of numbers that needed straightening and got to work on them. Holt came back the following afternoon with the traveling case, expression unreadable in the way of a man who had noticed things and chosen not to ask about them yet. He set the case on the porch and said, 2 men were watching the front of the boarding house from across the street. I went through the alley. He paused. One of them was Webb Greer. Everett nodded. You weren't followed back? I took the long way. Came in from the north field. Good. Don't mention this to anyone. I didn't plan to. Holt picked up his hat from the porch railing. That woman who's staying. Blackwell's looking for her. I know. Holt looked at him for a moment. You know what you're doing? Not entirely, Everett said honestly, but I know what I'm not doing. I'm not handing her over. Holt put his hat on. All right then. He went toward the barn without another word, which was exactly the response Everett had expected and counted on. Mara opened the case on the kitchen table, with hands that were not quite steady. Beneath a folded cotton blouse, beneath a false bottom she'd sewn in herself using a seam ripper and a needle and thread, was a small cloth-bound notebook. She held it for a moment before she opened it. 8 months, she said. Starting last August, Everett looked at the first page. The entries were careful and dense, the handwriting small to save space, each one dated and labeled with a property description, a name, an amount, and a notation of what made it suspicious. It was the work of someone who'd understood exactly what she was seeing and had been quietly terrified by it. The Halloran place is in here, she said, turning pages. And the Peterson claim. And here she stopped on a page near the middle, a payment to a county official, listed in Blackwell's own account book as administrative coordination fee. She looked up. $40, paid the same week the Peterson default was filed. He bribed the county clerk. At minimum. She turned another page. There's a similar payment the month before the Halloran transfer. Different amount, but the same notation. She paused on another entry. And here. This one I almost didn't understand when I first wrote it down. She turned the book so he could read it. March 4 payment to Territorial Judge H. Wills. Notation case review consultation, 90. Filed under miscellaneous operating expenses. Cross-reference. Halloran final transfer signed March 9. Everett was very still. He bribed a judge, Mara said quietly. That's federal territory, Everett said. That's not just county corruption. I know. She closed the notebook carefully. That's why he needed me gone. Not just because I'd seen too much. Because if anyone with actual authority looked at these numbers, really looked at them, Blackwell wouldn't just lose the land scheme. He'd lose everything. Everett stood up and went to the window. The evening light was flat and orange across the dry grass, and the road was empty. We can't take this to the county court, he said. He owns the county clerk, possibly the county judge. We'd need the territorial marshal. Harlan. He said the name without inflection. I've met him once. He's not a man who does favors. I'm not asking for a favor, Mara said. I'm offering him documented evidence of bribery of a territorial judge. That's not a favor, that's his job. She was right. He turned back from the window. She was sitting at the table with the notebook in front of her and her chin up, and there was something in her posture now that hadn't been there 3 days ago on his porch, not anger exactly, but something close to it. The look of someone who had been running and had just decided to stop running and turn around. We still need more, he said. Your ledger is strong, but the original records are in Blackwell's bank. If we had those, I know where the master ledger is kept, she said, in his private office. Locked cabinet, bottom drawer, left side. She said it without hesitation, like the layout of that office was a room she could walk through in her sleep. I put it there myself, the last time I organized his records. Everett looked at her for a long moment. The county's going to have a dance next Saturday, he said slowly. Whole town will be there. Her eyes didn't waver. The bank will be empty. It'll be locked. The rear window has a broken latch. I reported it twice. Blackwell never had it fixed. A pause. He thought no one would be stupid enough to try. He didn't know you yet, Everett said. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but close enough. No, she said. He didn't. Outside, the night was coming down quiet over the Montana hills, the kind of quiet that felt clean and unforgiving in equal measure. The road stayed empty. The grass moved in a light wind. Inside, 2 people sat at a kitchen table full of evidence and made plans that neither of them said out loud were dangerous, because saying so would have made them seem like they were asking to be talked out of it. The wolf wasn't coming yet, but they both knew it was somewhere out on that road, working its way toward them, and standing still was no longer a plan. They had until Saturday. The plan for Saturday was simple enough on paper, which meant it was the kind of plan that could go wrong in 11 different ways before they even got to town. In the meantime, there was work to do, and Mara did it. She didn't ask for another assignment after finishing Everett's account records. She just moved to the next problem, which was the property survey documents, which led her to the deed files, which led her to a filing system so disorganized it qualified as archaeological. Everett watched her work from a careful distance and said nothing, because it was obvious she needed the occupation more than she needed conversation. Organizing things was how she kept her hands busy while her mind worked on the problem she couldn't yet solve. He'd seen that before, in the years after his own worst losses. The way you had to keep moving, or the stillness would swallow you. She'd been at the ranch 4 days. When she came in from the barn, she'd been measuring the eastern boundary markers. Everett had pointed out to her, walking the fence line in the early morning before the heat came up, and set a hand-drawn map on the kitchen table without preamble. The stakes are wrong, she said. Someone moved them. The corner post on the southeastern edge is set back from where your original survey marker is. I found the original marker buried under about 8 inches of dirt and grass. Someone pulled it and reset it. She pointed to her map. If you measure from the reset post, you lose 40 acres. If you measure from the original marker, which is where the law says you measure from, those 40 acres are still yours. Everett looked at the map. He'd been ranching this land for 14 years, and he'd walked that fence line 100 times, and he had not caught it. The thought sat in his chest like something cold. When did they move it? He said. Sometime in the last 2 years. The dirt over the original marker is compacted but not completely settled. I'd guess 18 months, maybe a little more. She pulled out the county document from the folder she'd been carrying, which means it happened around the same time this was filed. Blackwell sent someone onto my land to move my boundary marker. Yes. While I was sleeping. Yes. Everett didn't say anything for a moment. He went to the kitchen window and stood there looking at the eastern field, which looked like it always had, unchanged and ordinary, not a field that had been quietly stolen from underneath him. He's patient, he said finally. I'll give him that. He's been doing this long enough to get good at it, Mara said. He doesn't rush. He sets things up months in advance, sometimes years. By the time a family realizes what's happening, the paperwork's already filed and recorded, and the county court has 3 documents that look perfectly official. She paused. That's why he hired a good bookkeeper, because good records look real. And I made his records look very real. Her voice was flat when she said it. Not self-pitying. Mara didn't do self-pity. from what he'd seen so far, but honest in the way that cut. "Stop that," Everett said without turning around. "Stop what?" "Blaming yourself for being competent at your job." He turned around. "He used you because you were good. That's on him, not you." She looked at him in a way that suggested she'd heard the words and didn't fully believe them yet, which was fair. Some things took time to settle in. "Either way," she said, and set the map beside the county document. "We have the original survey marker. I dug it up far enough to confirm the stamp. It's a territorial survey, stamped from 1869. If we can get a surveyor to come out and certify the position of that original marker, it legally invalidates the county filing." "You've been thinking about this." "I think about everything," she said, without apology. "It's what I do." He almost smiled, I noticed. On Thursday afternoon, a woman arrived at the ranch that Everett had not sent for and hadn't expected. He heard the wagon coming up the track and went to the porch, and the woman driving it pulled up and set the brake, with the efficiency of someone who drove her own wagon, because she didn't see the point in waiting for help. She was 50-something, broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, and the sort of expression that suggested she found most of the world mildly irritating and had decided to live with it. "Nora Bellamy," she said, climbing down. "I brought bread and some other things." She looked at Everett with direct, evaluating eyes. "I heard Mara was here." Everett calculated quickly. "Who told you?" "Ruth Macy at the dry goods. She saw Holt coming out of the boarding house alley with a traveling case. Nora set a basket on the porch. Before you start looking concerned, Ruth Macy would rather swallow nails than say a word to anyone connected to Blackwell. Her family had dealings with him 2 years ago. So did mine." She looked at him steadily. "I've been Mara's friend for 4 years. I'm not here to cause trouble." Mara appeared in the doorway behind Everett before he could respond. "Nora." There was something in her voice relief and something complicated underneath it. "You look like you've been through a fence," Nora said. "Come help me with this basket." They went inside, and Everett stayed on the porch for a moment, watching the road, the habit of it automatic now, every hour or so before following them in. In the kitchen, Nora was unpacking the basket with the focused efficiency of someone who communicated care through logistics rather than sentiment. Fresh bread, a jar of preserved peaches, a packet of dried herbs, a folded piece of paper which she set on the table separately. "From the Hallorans," she said, nodding at the paper. "James Halloran wrote it himself. His wife had to help him, his hands shake now. He's not well, but he wrote it." Mara unfolded the paper. Everett watched her face while she read it. Whatever was written there changed something in her expression. It went through careful and controlled, and came out the other side into something rawer. "He knows," she said. "He figured it out about 6 months ago, after the transfer went through and he couldn't do anything about it. His son found some of the paperwork, and James started looking at it more carefully." Nora folded her hands on the table. "He told me he kept thinking he'd made a mistake, that maybe he really had missed some payment. It took him months to accept that no, the record was wrong, that the signature on the default notice wasn't his." "It wasn't," Mara said quietly. "I saw that document. I knew the signature was wrong when I filed it. But I thought I told myself I was misremembering his handwriting. I told myself Blackwell had corrected an error in my original notation." She looked up. "I told myself a lot of things." "You told yourself what he needed you to believe," Nora said, not unkindly. "He's been doing this for a long time. He's good at making people doubt what they see." "There are others," Everett said. "Not just the Hallorans." "I know." Nora looked at him. "That's partly why I'm here. James Halloran isn't the only one who's figured out something was wrong. I can think of 4 families off the top of my head who have questions about transfers or default notices that never made sense to them. People who were too scared to say anything out loud because Blackwell's too powerful and the county court's too corrupt." She paused. "But if someone were building a case, if someone with the evidence to back it up were willing to put those families' names in a formal complaint to the territorial marshal." "Harlan," Everett said. "He's honest," Nora said. "He's difficult and he's not easy to convince, but he's honest, which is exactly what we need." She looked between them. "The question is whether what Mara has is enough to get him moving." "We're working on getting more," Everett said. Nora looked at him with those direct eyes. "How much risk?" "Some." She seemed to accept that with the same practical attitude she'd brought the bread. "All right, tell me what you need." They talked for 3 hours, and by the end of it there was a shape to the thing that hadn't existed before, not a plan exactly. more like the bones of one. Nora would quietly contact the families she knew about. Not officially, not in any way that would reach Blackwell's ears, but enough to let them know that someone was putting the evidence together. But Mara would prepare formal written summaries of everything in her ledger, organized by family, by transaction, by the names of the officials who appeared in the payment records. Everett would send a letter to the territorial marshal's office, in Helena, carefully worded, signed in his own name, which meant something because he was a landholder of record, with a clean reputation and no prior grievances. It was the letter that Blackwell wouldn't expect. He was watching for Mara. He wasn't watching for the quiet rancher who'd never bothered anyone. He underestimated you, Nora said to Everett, with something like satisfaction. He doesn't know me. People like Blackwell don't bother to know people they don't consider a threat. She packed up the empty basket. That's always the beginning of their problem. After Nora left, Mara sat at the table for a while without working, which was unusual enough that Everett noticed. She's right about Harlan, Mara said eventually. He won't move on my ledger alone. He'll want original documents. Something he can hold up in a federal hearing that wasn't written by the woman Blackwell already accused of theft. Which brings us back to Saturday, Everett said. Which brings us back to Saturday. He sat down across from her. You don't have to be the one to go in. I can copy the documents. You tell me what to look for. She shook her head before he finished the sentence. You don't know what you're looking at. The entries Blackwell disguised, they're not obvious unless you know his system. He has 2 sets of shorthand notations, one for legitimate transactions, one for the scheme. They look almost identical. She met his eyes. I need to be there. If Greer recognizes you, Saturday dance means everyone in town dressed up and moving around. Webb Greer isn't going to be standing outside the bank in the dark when there's a party 3 blocks away. She said it with more confidence than she probably felt, but it wasn't unreasonable logic, and I'll be careful. Everett looked at her for a moment. Can I ask you something? You can ask. When you were keeping Blackwell's books before you started noticing the wrong things, what did you think you were doing? I mean, what did you think the job was? She considered it. Making orders, she said. That's what I've always been good at. Numbers don't lie. They don't change their minds. They sit where you put them, and they add up the same way every time. She looked down at her hands, which were ink-stained from days of document work. I grew up in a house where nothing sat still and nothing added up, and there was no predicting what day was going to look like. My mother did what she could, but she stopped, redirected. Anyway, numbers made sense to me in a way that people didn't always. I was good at the work. Blackwell told me I was the best bookkeeper he'd had. A short, humorless exhale, which was probably true and which was exactly the problem. Everett was quiet for a moment. The house you grew up in. Big family, 4 of us kids. My father left when I was 9. My mother took in laundry. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you stated facts that had long since stopped being painful and were just true. I was the oldest. I learned to make things stretch, to look at what we had and figure out the most efficient use of all of it. She paused. My brother once told me I had an accountant's heart in a world that wanted accountants to be invisible. He was wrong about the second part. He was right about the second part, she said. For most of my working life, nobody wanted to hear from the bookkeeper unless a number was wrong. Women bookkeepers especially. You sit in the back, you keep the records straight, you don't offer opinions. Her jaw moved. Blackwell liked that I was quiet. He thought quiet meant I wasn't paying attention to anything beyond my own column of figures. But you were. I'm always paying attention. She said it without pride, just as a statement of fact. It's the only thing I know how to do. Everett thought about that for a moment, a woman who'd spent years making herself invisible in order to be allowed to do the work she was good at, who had been simultaneously too visible, not visible enough, and who had ended up on his porch with a broken rib and 1 boot because the thing that was supposed to make her useful had finally made her dangerous. After this is over, he said, "What do you want to do?" She looked at him like the question surprised her, like she hadn't let herself think that far. "Something of my own," she said finally. "Not someone else's books, something mine." He nodded. "Good." Friday came in hot and clear, the kind of August day that made everything look slightly overexposed, all the color bleached toward white at the edges. Holt came back from his usual supply run with feed, and the news that Blackwell had been in the general store that morning, talking loudly about the brazen theft perpetrated by a former employee and the absolute certainty of her arrest any day now. He wasn't talking to anyone particular, Holt said. just talking, making sure people heard him. He's building a story, Mara said. She was at the table, writing, and she didn't look up. The louder he says it, the more normal it sounds. By the time I'm publicly visible again, half the county will already believe I stole the money. She dipped her pen. He's done this before. The Peterson family, before he filed the default notice, he spent 2 weeks telling people around town that Gerald Peterson was a bad manager who'd run himself into debt. So when the notice appeared, nobody was surprised. How do you know that? Everett asked. Because I heard him. I was in that office. She set the pen down. I heard him say it to the county clerk over dinner the week before the filing. And I thought she stopped. I thought he was just sharing a concern about a client. I thought that's what businessmen did. Her mouth tightened. I was very stupid. You were trusting, Nora said from the other side of the table. She'd come back that morning, ostensibly with a pie, and practically to help with the document preparation. There's a difference. Not much of one, from where I'm sitting. There's a complete one, Nora said, with the firmness of someone not offering an opinion, but stating a fact. Stupid means you didn't have the information. Trusting means you had it and chose the better interpretation. You're not responsible for other people's capacity for cruelty. Mara didn't answer, but she picked up the pen again, which was her version of accepting the point. By late afternoon, she had produced 6 formally written summaries, one for each of the families she had clear evidence for, including the Hallorans and the Petersons, plus 4 others, whose situation she'd noted in her ledger. Each summary was dated, cross-referenced to specific ledger entries, and written in the precise formal language of a financial report, not emotional, not accusatory, just documented. The kind of document a territorial marshal could put in front of a federal judge without embarrassment. This is good work, Nora said, reading the Halloran summary. It's accurate, Mara said. That's more important. Everett read Mara's drafts over her shoulder and said nothing, partly because they didn't need editing, and partly because watching her work gave him a particular feeling he didn't examine closely. She wrote with the same complete attention she brought to everything fully inside the task, not performing competence, but simply being competent, without any apparent need for anyone to notice. He'd noticed. He went to write the letter to the territorial marshal's office. It took him 4 drafts, which was 3 more than he usually needed for anything he wrote. He kept starting over, because the letter kept sounding either too mild, the kind of thing that would sit in a pile for weeks, or too aggressive, the kind of thing that would make a careful man like Harlan defensive before he'd read the evidence. He needed it to sound exactly like what it was, a landowner with documentation, no personal vendetta, making a formal report of what appeared to be a significant pattern of fraud in the county. On the 4th draft, he got it right. He left out Mara's name entirely, which was deliberate. The evidence would speak for itself when Harlan saw it. What he needed now was to get Harlan to look. He sealed it and gave it to Holt, with instructions to ride to the Territorial Express office in Millhaven, not the local Post, which ran through the county clerk's office first thing in the morning. Holt looked at the letter, then at Everett. You sure? Yes. Once it goes, Blackwell's going to hear eventually that something's moving against him. I know. Everett looked at the sealed envelope. That's why we need to get into that bank before he does. Saturday morning. Mara woke up before dawn and lay still for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling of the small room Everett had cleared out for her, listening to the early birds outside, and running through the layout of Blackwell's bank, the way she'd been doing every morning for the past 3 days. The rear entrance. The back hallway. The office door, which had a lock she'd watched Blackwell open 100 times, not a complicated mechanism. A standard pin tumbler, the kind that a thin piece of metal could persuade open if you knew what you were doing. Nora had brought the piece of metal. She hadn't explained where she'd learned to use it, and Mara hadn't asked. They rode into town in the early afternoon, arriving well before the dance was scheduled to start, which meant the streets were full of normal Saturday activity, and 2 people on horseback attracted no particular attention. Everett wore a hat pulled lower than usual. Mara wore a dress Nora had brought from town, blue, plain, different from anything Blackwell's men would associate with the woman they were looking for, and kept her hair up under a hat of her own. She felt conspicuous despite all of it. She felt like every person they passed could see exactly what she was planning. Nobody looked at them twice. They stabled the horses at the far end of town at a livery Everett used occasionally. run by a man named Coe, who had the professional and curiosity of someone who'd decided long ago that knowing too much about his customers was bad for business. Everett paid for 2 stalls and a full feed, and Coe didn't ask a single question. Then they walked. The bank occupied the corner of Main and 2nd Street, a solid brick building, 2 stories, with a narrow alley running along its eastern side and a rear yard accessed through a gate off the alley. The rear window Mara had mentioned was on the ground floor of the office wing, overlooking the yard. They didn't walk past the bank directly. They walked past the hardware store 2 buildings down, then cut through a side street and came around through the alley from the opposite direction. Everett had been through this part of town 100 times and knew it well enough to navigate without looking like he was navigating. The dance started at 6. It was now 4:30. They found a place to wait in the shadows behind the grain merchant's loading dock, not comfortable, not particularly safe feeling, but out of sight lines from the main street. Mara stood with her back against the wall and her hands quiet at her sides and didn't talk much, which Everett respected. He didn't talk either. The waiting was the worst part of any plan, in his experience, and filling it with words didn't help. Around 5:15, the music started. They could hear it from 3 blocks away, a fiddle, then a second fiddle, then the heavier thud of a bass drum marking time. The street noise changed character as people began moving toward the dance hall. Another 30 minutes, Mara said quietly. Closer to 45. She looked at him. Are you nervous? Yes, he said without inflection. Good. She went back to looking at the alley. People who aren't nervous in situations like this make mistakes. At 6:15, they moved. The alley was empty. The gate to the bank's rear yard had a simple latch, which Everett lifted with one hand. The yard beyond was nothing much a woodpile, a water barrel, the rear face of the brick building. The window Mara had described was at hip height, a small double pane with a wooden frame, and when Everett tried it, it didn't open smoothly, but it moved. The latch was broken exactly as she'd said. The metal striker was bent and didn't quite catch the plate. It still took some persuasion. Everett worked at it for 2 full minutes, which felt longer, while Mara stood behind him watching the gate. The fiddle music drifted over the rooftops. A dog barked somewhere on the far side of town and went quiet. The window gave. They went in. The interior was dark, the air inside dense with the particular smell of banked financial anxiety, old paper, ink, the faint metallic edge of coins. Mara moved ahead of him as soon as they were inside, navigating the back corridor with a confidence that came from 3 years of walking it, her hand trailing along the wall, but her feet certain of where they were going. The office door was locked. Nora's piece of metal took 90 seconds. Inside, Mara went straight to the cabinet bottom drawer, left side as she'd said, locked. She tried 2 positions with the metal before something clicked and the drawer slid open. The ledger was there, large, bound in dark green leather, dense with entries. Mara sat down on the floor with it in her lap, tilted it toward the thin line of fading daylight from the office's single high window, and started reading. Paper, she said quietly without looking up. Everett found a drawer with blank paper and brought her a sheaf of it. She began copying. Not everything she knew exactly what she needed, had planned it during those early morning ceiling-staring sessions, and she moved through the ledger with the focused speed of someone who'd helped create the filing system and knew exactly where everything lived. Everett stood in the doorway and listened to the building. It was quiet. It was supposed to be quiet. Everyone was at the dance. He was still listening when, 12 minutes into the copying, he heard footsteps. Not from the front entrance, from inside the building. Upstairs. The specific creak of someone who knew this floor and didn't feel the need to be quiet about it. He stepped back into the office. Someone's in the building, he said, barely above a breath. Mara didn't stop writing. How close? Stairs, coming down. She kept writing. Mara, 2 more entries. Her pen didn't slow. The payment to the judge. I need the payment to the judge. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. A pause, someone checking something, or listening. Everett put his hand on her arm. She was already on the last entry, her pen moving in rapid, controlled strokes. She finished the line, folded the papers once with quick precision, and stood up. He got the ledger back in the drawer. She got the drawer closed. She had the papers inside her jacket by the time Everett had the office door pulled to not latched. There wasn't time, and they were moving back down the corridor toward the rear of the building when they heard the office doors swing open behind them. A long pause. The sound of someone standing still and then moving, looking at something. The cabinet, most likely, checking the drawer. They were out the window before whoever it was reached the corridor. Everett pulled the window down behind him. They crossed the yard at a controlled walk. Running would have been loud, would have been wrong, and Mara got through the gate first, and he followed her through and latched it behind them. And they walked out of the alley at a normal pace, while his heart was doing something that didn't qualify as normal at all. They didn't speak until they were 2 streets away. "Did you get it?" he said. She put one hand on her jacket where the papers were. All of it. A breath. The judge payment, both sets of official payments. The full transfer record for the Halloran property, cross-reference to the forged default. Another breath. "It's enough." Everett looked at her. She was pale and her hands were shaking slightly, the pen ink still dark on her fingers, and she was looking straight ahead with the expression of someone who had just run a very long way, and was only now allowing herself to feel it. "Good," he said. They walked back to the livery in the gathering dark. The fiddle was still playing 3 blocks away, bright and oblivious. That night, riding back to the ranch under a sky full of sharp stars, Mara was quiet for a long time. Everett didn't push. He was listening to the dark around them and watching the road ahead and thinking about the letter that was already on its way to Helena, and about the papers folded against her ribs, and about the footsteps they'd heard in that building, whose footsteps, and what they'd seen when they opened the office door, and what that meant for how much time they had left before the thing they'd set in motion became impossible to stop. He didn't know who had been in that building, but he was fairly sure by morning that Blackwell would. They made it back to the ranch by 9 o'clock, and Everett didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with his rifle close, and the lamp turned low, and listened to the night sounds outside, with the particular attention of a man who had just done something that couldn't be undone. The letter was already in Millhaven, or close to it. The copied documents were spread on the table in front of him, dried now, Mara's handwriting small and precise across 6 pages of bank-quality paper. Whatever footsteps they'd heard in that building, whoever had been there, whatever they'd seen when they opened that office door, the thing was already in motion. You couldn't unring a bell. Mara had gone to her room without argument, which told him how tired she actually was, because Mara Whitlock without energy was the only version of her that didn't push back on something. He'd heard her moving around for about 20 minutes after she went in, the quiet sounds of a person who wasn't sleeping either, and then silence. He was on his 3rd cup of coffee when the sound came. Not from the road this time. From the eastern field, the distant, too regular sound of a horse moving at a careful pace. Someone who didn't want to be heard on the road and had come cross-country instead. Everett was at the back door with the rifle before the sound got closer. He waited. The moon was adequate, not full, but enough to see shapes in the field, and what he made out, after a long minute, was a single horse, and on it a single rider who was moving too slowly and too carefully to be someone with bad intentions. Bad intentions moved fast. This looked like someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. "Callahan," the voice was low, familiar. "It's Pete Halloran, James's boy." Everett let out a breath he hadn't fully registered holding. "Come in." Slowly. Pete Halloran was 23 or 24, lean as a fence post, with his father's wide-set eyes and none of his father's ease of manner. He came through the back door with his hat in his hands, and the look of a young man who'd ridden a long way on urgency alone. "Someone was in Blackwell's bank tonight," he said, before Everett could speak. "Webb Greer found the window open. He told Blackwell at the dance I was outside. I heard it through the wall." He looked at Everett directly. "Blackwell knows someone went into his office. He doesn't know who yet, but he's guessing." "Who's he guessing?" He said your name. Pete's jaw worked. And hers. Everett set the rifle against the wall. "Sit down. You want coffee?" "No. I want to know if what Nora Bellamy told my father is true. That someone's building a case. That there's actual evidence." He was trying to keep his voice even, and not quite managing it. The words came out with the rough edge of something long contained. "My father thinks he lost that land because he wasn't smart enough to read the papers right. He thinks it's his fault. He's thought that for 7 months, and it's Pete stopped. Swallowed. It's been hard to watch." From the hallway doorway, Mara's voice came quiet. He didn't lose it because he wasn't smart. He lost it because the signature on the default notice wasn't his. Pete turned. Mara was standing in the doorway in her plain work dress, her hair down, clearly not having slept at all. She came to the table and sat down across from Pete Halloran and looked at him steadily. "I saw that document," she said. "I filed it. I didn't know what I was filing at the time, but I remember the signature. Your father signs his name with a long tail on the H and a particular break in the double L. The signature on that notice had neither. Someone copied his handwriting and didn't copy it well enough. She paused. I have that in my ledger. The notation I made at the time, when something felt wrong and I couldn't explain why. It's documented. Pete stared at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was hard to look at directly, the specific expression of someone receiving information that simultaneously fixes something and breaks something else. He needs to hear that, Pete said. From you, not secondhand. He will, Mara said, when we're further along. When there's something in place that means him coming forward doesn't just make him a target. He's already a target. He's already a victim, she said, not unkindly. There's a difference. When we go to the marshal, I want your father's testimony, and I want him protected when he gives it. That means we go with everything at once, not in pieces. Pete looked at her, this woman he'd never met, sitting at a stranger's kitchen table in the middle of the night, talking about his father's land and his father's signature with the calm certainty of someone who had already run the numbers and knew what they added up to. He seemed to make a decision. What do you need from us? He said. Your father's testimony, written when you're ready. Any original documents you still have from the default filing, even if they look legitimate on the surface. And she glanced at Everett, for just a moment quiet. No one outside your family should know you've been here. My mother's going to ask where I rode to. Tell her you checked the eastern fence, Everett said. That's true enough. Pete put his hat back on. He looked at Mara one more time. Nora said you worked for him 3 years. Yes. And he did this to you anyway. He did this to me because of it, she said. I knew too much. Pete nodded slowly. Then I hope you take everything from him, he said, not with heat, but with the flat, specific weight of someone who meant it completely. He went back out through the dark the way he'd come, and the sound of his horse faded east into the field. Sunday came and went quietly, and then Monday, and by Tuesday morning there was enough tension in the ranch house to make the air feel slightly wrong, like the hour before a storm when the temperature drops and the birds stop talking. Blackwell knew someone had been in his office. They didn't know exactly what he'd done with that knowledge, and the not knowing was the worst part. Holt went into town Tuesday for the regular supply run and came back with news that was worse than expected and better than feared. Worse, Blackwell had gone to the sheriff Sunday morning and formally requested that a search be conducted for Mara Whitlock, fugitive, and for any persons known to be harboring her. The sheriff had agreed. Better, the search was going to start with the boarding houses and the lower county farms, which meant they had time, but not much of it. Greer was at the feed store when I was there, Holt added. He wasn't buying feed. Who was he talking to? Everett asked. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was watching. Everett thought about that. Did he see you? He saw me. He knows I work for you. Holt set the supply bags down. He didn't follow me. I made sure. After Holt left, Mara came in from the small room she'd turned into a working space. She'd taken over a spare table and covered it in organized stacks of paper and stood in the kitchen doorway. If Greer saw Holt in town, Blackwell knows the direction to look, she said. He already knew, probably. I'm not that far from the county road. So we don't have until the marshal responds. She said it without inflection. Just a fact being processed. No, Everett agreed. We probably don't. She came to the table and sat down. She looked at the copied documents and her ledger, and the 6 family summaries she'd written, all organized in a folder Nora had brought from town. She sat with her hands flat on the table and thought, visibly, the way she did when she was working through something, not distracted, just occupied in a way that was almost physical. If we send everything to Helena, she said, it could be 2 weeks before anyone moves on it. Maybe 3. Harlan needs to review it, assign deputies, get authorization for a federal warrant if there's a judge involved. She tapped one finger on the folder. 2 weeks is too long. What's the alternative? We stop waiting for Harlan to come to us. She looked up. We go to him. Everett considered it. Helena's 4 days' ride. 3 hard. A pause. Or we could send Nora. She's not connected to me officially. If she rides with the documents, the originals from the ledger, my family summaries, your letter, and the copies from the bank, and she presents it at Harlan's office in person. Harlan won't move on a woman arriving unannounced with a folder of documents. He'll move on a folder that includes bribery of a territorial judge, Mara said. That's not a county matter. That's his jurisdiction, directly. He doesn't have a choice. She met his eyes, And if Nora tells him there are 6 families ready to testify, and that the man responsible just filed a search warrant that's going to bury the evidence and the witnesses. He moves faster. He moves much faster. It was the right call. Everett knew it, and the knowing made him slightly uncomfortable, because it meant the pace of the whole thing was about to change in ways that were going to be hard to control. Up until now, they'd been building carefully, step by step, with some ability to stop and reconsider. Once Nora rode to Helena, that careful building was over. "I'll talk to Nora," he said. Mara was already pulling the documents together. Nora came to the ranch that afternoon and listened to the plan without interrupting, which was unusual for Nora, and which told you she understood the urgency. When Mara finished laying out the reasoning, Nora sat for a moment and then said, "I'll need a letter from you, Everett. In your name, formally requesting the marshal's assistance. Not the one you sent by post, a new one that I can put in his hands. I'll write it tonight. I'll need to leave by first light tomorrow." She looked at the folder on the table. "Are these copies or originals?" "Mix of," Mara said. "The family summaries are my originals. The bank documents are copies I made Saturday night. The ledger entries that cross-reference the judge payment, those are copies." She paused. "The originals are still in Blackwell's cabinet, unless he's moved them. Will Harlan accept copies?" "He'll accept them as grounds to go look at the originals." She said it with certainty. "The copies are enough to justify a federal examination of the bank's records. That's all we need them to do." Nora picked up the Halloran summary and read through it quickly, turning the pages with the practiced speed of a woman who'd done her share of reading fine print over the years. She set it down. "This is thorough," she said. "It's accurate," Mara said for the second time in a week. "Same thing in this case." Nora looked at her steadily. "You know that when this starts moving, Blackwell's going to come at you personally, not just through the theft charge. He's going to say whatever he needs to say to discredit you before Harlan gets here. I know. He'll talk about your size. He'll talk about you being a woman without a husband or a family name. He'll use everything he can find. I know that too." Mara's voice didn't waver, but something tightened briefly around her eyes. "He's been using those things against me my whole working life. The difference is that before, he was doing it quietly, and I wasn't in a position to answer. Now," she looked at the folder, at the 6 summaries, at the copied documents. "Now I have something to answer with." Nora held her gaze for a moment and then nodded. "All right," she said. "I'll take it." That night, Everett wrote the letter to Harlan. It was shorter than the first one, more specific, less careful. It named Blackwell directly. It named the judge. It said, plainly, that there were witnesses and documents, and that the situation was escalating, and that if the marshal's office didn't move soon, the evidence and the people who could speak to it were going to be in danger. He signed his name and pressed his ranch seal into the wax and gave it to Nora. When she came by at 5 in the morning, the sky still dark, her horse already saddled. Mara stood on the porch and watched Nora ride down the track toward the main road, the sound of hooves fading into the pre-dawn quiet. "She'll be all right," Everett said from behind her. "She'll be better than all right." Mara didn't turn around. Nora's tougher than she looks. Most people are. A pause. She crossed her arms against the morning chill. "What do we do while we wait? We stay ready." He came to stand beside her at the porch rail. "And we don't underestimate Blackwell." As if in answer to that particular statement, Holt appeared from around the side of the barn at a pace side of the barn. A pace that wasn't running but was close to it, and the expression on his face said that something had happened that required immediate attention. "Rider on the south road," he said, "coming fast. County badge." The 3 of them looked at each other. County badge meant the sheriff or one of his deputies, which meant the search hadn't started with the boarding houses, after all. "Get inside," Everett told Mara. "No," she said it flatly, without heat, and turned to face the south road. "I'm done hiding behind doors. That's finished." He looked at her. He thought about arguing. He decided against it. "Then stand where I can see you," he said, and went to get the rifle. The rider came up the track at a hard trot and pulled up at the gate a deputy Everett knew by sight, a young man named Ferris, red-faced from the ride and clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Behind him, 2 more riders were hanging back at the end of the track, not closing. "Waiting morning, Callan," Ferris said. His eyes moved to Mara and then back to Everett with the expression of a man who'd found what he was sent to find and wasn't sure if that was good news or bad news. "I've got a warrant. For Mara Whitlock." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Theft and fraud. She's to come with me for transport to county. Let me see the warrant, Everett said. Ferris rode forward and held it out. Everett took it, unfolded it, read it. It was a real warrant. Blackwell had made sure of that. Properly signed, properly sealed, the theft charge and Mara's name right there in ink. Signed by the same county judge whose name appeared in Mara's ledger next to a $90 payment. Everett looked up. This warrant was signed by Judge Wills. That's right. You're aware that Judge Wills has received payment from Silas Blackwell for services related to property transfers in this county. Ferris blinked. I have documented evidence of it. In my house. Dated and cross-referenced. Everett folded the warrant back up and held it out. You can take this warrant and execute it if you want. But I'd think carefully about whether you want your name attached to an action authorized by a judge who's about to come under federal investigation. Ferris took the warrant back slowly. He looked at Mara. She was standing on the porch with her arms at her sides and her chin level, looking at him with an expression that was not defiant and not frightened, but somewhere more complicated than either, the expression of a woman who was tired of being afraid and had decided to stop. I'm not hiding, she said to Ferris. If there were a legitimate warrant from a legitimate judge, based on something I actually did, I'd answer it. But that warrant is signed by a man who was paid to process documents for the same person who forged the arrest complaint against me. She kept her voice measured. You're not arresting a thief, deputy. You're helping a corrupt banker eliminate a witness. Ferris looked very young suddenly. I'm just doing my job. I know, she said. Not cruel. I know you are. But your job is about to get a lot more complicated. And I think you know that. Ferris sat on his horse for a long moment. He looked at the two riders at the end of the track. He looked at Everett, who was holding the rifle with the relaxed grip of a man who wasn't pointing it at anyone, but could very quickly. He looked at Mara. He turned his horse around. I need to consult with the sheriff, he said, to no one in particular. About the warrant, he rode back toward the two waiting deputies. There was a brief, inaudible conversation, and then all three of them turned and rode back down the south road. Everett watched them go. That's not the end of it. No, Mara agreed. That's Blackwell finding out his judge's name is already in play. She came down off the porch. How long do you think before he changes approach? 24 hours. Maybe less. Then we need the families together before he does. She turned to Holt, who was standing by the barn gate. Can you get to the Halloran place by this afternoon? Holt looked at Everett. Everett nodded. Tell Pete Halloran we need whoever's ready to come to the ranch tomorrow morning, Mara said. Anyone who has documents. Anyone who has testimony. We're not waiting anymore. They came the next morning, more than Mara had expected. The Hallorans, Pete and his older sister Clara, their father James in the wagon seat, wrapped in a coat despite the August heat, moving with the deliberate care of someone for whom movement was now expensive. The Peterson family, Gerald Peterson, his wife Ruth, and their eldest son carrying a tin box of documents. A woman named Addie Crane, alone, who'd lost a water rights claim the previous year and had kept every piece of paper she'd ever received from the county. Two brothers named Fowler, who'd lost a small grazing lease and hadn't understood why until Nora had talked to them the week before. And from the south, arriving separately and slightly late, an older man Everett didn't recognize, driving a single horse and a weathered buggy, who turned out to be a retired land surveyor named August Price, who had done territorial surveys in this county for 20 years, and had, he said, noticed certain discrepancies in the recent county filings that had bothered him considerably. When Price introduced himself and explained why he'd come, Mara stood very still for a moment. You're a registered territorial surveyor, she said, Price said. Retired 3 years. But your certification is still valid. He looked at her with the evaluating expression of someone recognizing sharp thinking. It would be, yes, for purposes of legal testimony. The original survey marker for Everett's eastern boundary, she said. I can show you exactly where it is. If you certify its position, it legally invalidates the county's amended filing. Price pulled out a pair of spectacles and put them on, which seemed to be his equivalent of rolling up his sleeves. Show me the documents first, he said. Then we'll go look at the marker. Mara had them all in the kitchen and the adjoining room, more people than the house had held in 11 years, and Everett stood in the doorway and watched her work the room, not performing, not charming, just being exactly what she was, the person who understood the evidence better than anyone present and could explain it plainly enough, that a tired farmer and a retired surveyor and a frightened woman with a box of water rights documents could all follow the same thread. James Halloran, from his chair in the corner, watched her with an expression that was difficult to look at directly. He was not a well man. The illness that had been slowly taking his strength for the past year was visible in the color of his skin and the effort it took him to remain upright, but his eyes were sharp. And when Mara read out the notation she'd made about his signature, he closed those eyes for a long moment and then opened them again. "I knew it," he said. His voice was rough. "I kept telling myself I must have missed something, that it must have been my mistake." He looked at his son. "I knew it wasn't right. It wasn't," Mara said directly. "It was never your mistake." Clara Halloran had her hand on her father's arm and was looking at Mara with an expression that said several things at once, none of them words. By noon they had it organized, 7 sets of testimony, 4 collections of original documents, Price's agreement to certify the survey marker, and the formal written statements from each family that Mara had drafted that morning before anyone arrived. She'd been up since 3. After the families left carefully, separately, by different routes on Everett's suggestion, the house went quiet again, and Mara sat down at the kitchen table with the abruptness of someone whose legs had simply decided they were done. Everett put coffee in front of her without asking. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." A pause. No, another pause. James Halloran knew it wasn't his fault. He knew, and he still spent 7 months believing it might be, because that's what Blackwell built, not just the fake documents, but the doubt. He built it so carefully that even the victim couldn't be sure. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "That's the worst of it. Not the land. The doubt." Everett sat down across from her. "You built something today to answer it. We'll see if it's enough." "It's enough," he said. "I'm not saying it from comfort. I'm saying it because I've looked at what you put together, and it's enough." She looked at him with a particular expression she used when she was deciding whether to take something at face value or examine it further. She seemed to decide to take it at face value. "Thank you," she said, "for opening the door. That first night." He looked at his coffee. "It was late, and you were on your knees. Most men would have closed it. Most men would have been smarter," he said. "I'm not always smart." She almost smiled. "You're smarter than you let on. So are you." "I let on quite a lot," she said, and this time she did smile, briefly the first real unguarded smile he'd seen from her, and it changed her face completely, pulled it into something younger and warmer and entirely unperformed. He didn't look away fast enough, which she noticed, and which made the smile flicker slightly before she looked back at her coffee. That afternoon, Price and Everett walked the eastern fence line, and Mara showed Price exactly where she'd found the original survey marker buried in the grass and dirt. Price crouched over it with his instruments for a long time, measuring and noting, and then he stood up and took off his spectacles and said, "The county filing places the boundary 14 feet inside this marker. This marker is primary. The filing is incorrect." "Legally incorrect," Mara said. "Legally and factually incorrect. The two are the same thing in a boundary dispute." He looked across the pasture. Whoever moved the post knew what they were doing. But they didn't bank on anyone going back to find the original. "Blackwell doesn't think people look closely," Morris said. "He thinks they see the official document and accept it. Most people do," Price said. "I know." She looked at the marker, half visible in the trampled grass. That's what he counted on. They were walking back toward the house when Holt met them at the barn with the same fast but not running pace he'd used 2 days ago, which Everett had already learned was Holt's specific gait for bad news he was trying not to escalate. "Wagon coming up the main track," Holt said. "Sheriff's wagon. Full size." He looked at Everett, and Blackwell's carriage behind it. Everett looked at the ranch house, at the fence line. At the gate at the end of the track, still 60 yards off, but visible now, the sheriff's wagon, and behind it the black enclosed carriage that belonged to Silas Blackwell. He thought about Mara's face when she'd said, "I'm done hiding behind doors. That's finished." He went to get the rifle. By the time the wagon reached the gate, Mara was already on the porch. She hadn't hidden. She wasn't going to. Behind her, the kitchen door opened and August Price came out, still in his surveying coat, his instrument case under one arm. He stood to one side of the door without being asked. The sheriff's wagon stopped. The black carriage stopped behind it. The sheriff climbed down, not Ferris this time. The actual sheriff, Dan Cooley, a broad man who'd held the job for 6 years, and whose loyalties had been reliably with whoever wrote the largest check. Behind him, 4 deputies arranged themselves with the casual efficiency of a practiced display of force. The carriage door opened. Silas Blackwell stepped out. He was younger than Everett had expected, mid-50s, well-dressed in the way of a man who understood that presentation was its own kind of power, with the steady, deliberate movements of someone used to having space made for him. He looked at the house. He looked at the porch. He looked at Mara. Something crossed his face when he saw her standing there, not surprise, but recalculation. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't trying to run. She was standing in full view on the front porch of a ranch house, looking at him with the patient expression of someone who had been expecting this visit and had things prepared for it. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't that. "Miss Whitlock," he said. His voice was measured, almost pleasant. "I think you know why I'm here." "You're here because someone accessed your office Saturday night," she said. "And you want the documents back." She tilted her head slightly. "That's not going to happen." Blackwell looked at Everett. "Callahan, I'd advise you to consider your position here carefully." "I've considered it," Everett said. "You're harboring a fugitive. That's a criminal offense in this territory." "I'm employing a bookkeeper," Everett said, "which is legal. And I'd remind you that the warrant against her was signed by a judge who received $90 from your accounts the week before he signed the Halloran transfer. We have the documentation." He kept his voice level. "If you'd like to discuss the warrant, I'd suggest doing it with the territorial marshal, who has been contacted and is currently in receipt of a formal complaint." Blackwell went very still. It was the stillness of a man recalculating under pressure, not panicking, because men like Blackwell didn't panic, but adjusting, the way a careful chess player adjusts when a piece they weren't watching turns out to matter. His eyes went from Everett to Mara and back, and in that brief transit Everett saw something he recognized from years of reading difficult men and difficult situations. Blackwell hadn't known about the marshal contact. He'd thought he had more time. "Whatever documents you think you have," Blackwell says, "were obtained through criminal trespass." "The documents I have are my own ledger," Mara said from the porch. "Which I wrote, which is mine, which I carried out of that boarding house in my own traveling case." She looked at him steadily. "And I have 9 months of notes on your accounting practices. In my handwriting, from the time I worked for you legally." A pause. "You didn't know about the separate ledger, did you?" It wasn't a question. She could see from his face that he hadn't. "Surrender yourself, Miss Whitlock," the sheriff said, stepping forward. "We can do this easily, or we can do it difficultly." Sheriff coolly. August Price stepped forward from beside the door, and something in his dry, deliberate manner made everyone on the wagon look at him. "My name is August Price. I am a registered territorial land surveyor, certification number 47-12 from the Helena office, active since 1863. I have, in the last 2 hours, examined the original survey markers on this property and certified that the county boundary amendment filed last spring is factually and legally incorrect." He held up his instrument case. "I have the measurements. I have the notation. And I intend to file a formal correction with the Territorial Survey Office, which will include a statement that the original marker shows evidence of deliberate disturbance." He looked at Blackwell with the mild expression of a man who'd spent decades looking at ground and had learned to be patient with people who thought they could change what the ground said. "That's a separate criminal matter from whatever else the marshal is currently reviewing." The porch had gone quiet. Behind Mara, the kitchen door opened again. James Halloran came out first, moving slowly with Pete steadying him. Then Gerald Peterson and Ruth behind him, and Addie Crane, and the 2 Fowler brothers. They filed onto the porch and down the steps and arranged themselves, not dramatically, not in any staged way, just present, standing on the ground in front of the house and looking at the man who had taken things from them. Blackwell looked at the faces. He counted them. His expression didn't change. Men like Blackwell were very good at not letting their expression change when they needed to. But his hands, holding the rim of the carriage door, tightened. He'd come here to collect a frightened woman and eliminate a piece of evidence. What he'd found was a retired surveyor with certified measurements, 7 families with testimony, documented evidence of bribery of a territorial judge, and a man with a rifle standing very calmly in the yard of his own property. "This isn't over," Blackwell said. He said it to Mara specifically, and his voice was still measured, still controlled, with nothing in it that technically qualified as a threat. "No," Mara said, "it isn't." She met his eyes across the yard. but it's closer to over than you think." Blackwell got back in his carriage. The sheriff looked at his deputies. Some kind of decision moved across his face, a man doing the arithmetic of his own situation and not loving the result. He climbed back onto the wagon. They drove away. When the sound of the carriage wheels faded down the road, nobody on the porch spoke for a long moment. James Halloran was the one who finally broke it, not with anything significant, just a long exhale that seemed to carry a great deal of weight. Pete put his hand on his father's shoulder. Mara stood at the edge of the porch and watched the south road long after the wagon was gone, and Everett watched her, and he thought about what Nora was doing 4 days' ride north of here, and what she was carrying, and how fast a determined woman on a good horse could move when the situation required it. Fast enough, he hoped, because Blackwell was going to come back, and the next time, he was going to come with more than a sheriff and a warrant. Blackwell didn't come back that night. He didn't come back the next day either, which was almost worse than if he had, because the waiting had its own particular weight, the kind that settled into your shoulders and didn't shift. Everett slept in 3-hour intervals, waking to check the road, the south field, the eastern fence line. Holt did the same without being asked. The ranch ran on that particular quiet that comes when everyone knows something is coming and nobody can say when. Mara worked. That was how she handled the waiting, the same way she'd handled everything since she'd arrived. She sat at the work table and organized what they had into the most coherent possible presentation for the territorial marshal, the original ledger, tabbed and indexed, the copied bank documents, annotated in her precise hand with cross-references to the corresponding ledger entries, the 7 family testimony statements, signed, August Price's surveyor certification, formal and dated, and a 12-page summary document she'd written herself that walked through the entire scheme from beginning to end in the kind of clear, numbered sequence that left no room for confusion. She worked on that summary for 2 days straight, stopping only to eat when Everett put something in front of her, and she rewrote the opening 3 times because the first 2 versions, she said, sounded like someone trying to make an argument. The third version just stated what happened, in order, with the evidence attached to each statement. Arguments can be challenged, she told Everett, on the second evening, when he asked why she'd crossed out a full paragraph and started again. Facts are harder to get around. If I tell Harlan what I think, he can disagree. If I show him what the numbers say, he has to deal with the numbers. Everett read the finished version when she was done. It was the clearest piece of writing he'd seen in years, not elegant, not designed to impress, just ruthlessly organized and complete. Every claim had a source. Every source was documented. Reading it, you got the sense of a person who had decided that the only way to be believed was to leave nothing to interpretation. "This is good," he said. She took the document back and added a footnote she'd forgotten. "It'll do," she said. Nora's horse came up the track on Thursday morning, 9 days after she'd left, and Everett heard it from the barn where he was working and knew from the pace steady, not rushed, but purposeful that she was bringing news worth bringing. She looked like 9 days of hard riding. Her coat was dusty. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she had the particular expression of
someone who'd accomplished a thing and was holding the accomplishment carefully
until she could put it down somewhere safe. Mara came out of the house when she heard the horse. "He's coming," Nora said before she'd fully dismounted. "Harlan. He's coming himself, not a deputy." She handed Everett the reins and pulled a folded letter from her inside coat pocket. "He gave me that to bring back. Formal notice of investigation. Read it." Everett unfolded it. The letter was from Territorial Marshal Elias Harlan, signed in a hand that pressed hard into the paper the signature of a man who wrote with authority and knew it. It stated, in formal but unambiguous language, that the office of the Territorial Marshal had received evidence of potential criminal fraud, bribery of a territorial officer, and falsification of public land records, and that a formal investigation was being opened, and that all persons with relevant evidence were requested to preserve it and make themselves available. At the bottom, a handwritten addition, "I expect to arrive in your county within 5 to 6 days. Do not destroy evidence. Do not allow evidence to be relocated." E. Harlan Everett handed it to Mara. She read it twice. Then she set it on the porch railing and pressed both hands flat on it, like she was making sure it was real. "He read everything?" she asked Nora. "He read everything the first night. Kept me and Helena 2 days while his clerk made copies, and he asked questions." Nora sat down heavily on the porch steps and pulled off one boot examining her foot with the look of someone conducting a damage assessment. He asked about you specifically. Your background, your employment, how long you'd worked for Blackwell. I told him everything I knew. What did he say? He said, and I'm quoting him exactly, "If her documentation is as thorough as this summary indicates, she's either the most organized embezzler in territorial history, or she's exactly what she appears to be." Nora looked up. Then he said he was inclined toward the latter, given that an embezzler doesn't typically keep a private ledger documenting their own employer's crimes. Something shifted in Mara's face, not quite relief, because relief was still too far away, but the specific easing of a tension that had been there so long it had started to feel like a physical structure. 5 to 6 days, she said. Probably 5. He doesn't move slowly. Blackwell's going to hear he's coming. Blackwell's probably going to hear within the day, Nora said, pulling her boot back on. Word travels. And Harlan doesn't hide what he's doing. He thinks transparency is a kind of power. He filed the investigation notice with the federal clerk in Helena before he left, which means it's public record. Everett thought about that. So Blackwell knows he's got 5 days to do whatever he's going to do. Yes. Nora stood up, brushing dust from her coat, which means whatever he hasn't done yet, he's going to try to do now. He tried on Friday. Not Blackwell personally. Blackwell was careful enough not to put himself anywhere near what happened Friday. But it had his logic in it, which was more visible than a signature. Holt found it when he went to check the Eastern's fence line in the morning. 3 sections of fence cut, the wire pulled back, and 15 of Everett's cattle driven through the gap and scattered into the open range beyond. Not stolen, just scattered, which was in some ways worse, because stolen cattle gave you something to chase and someone to charge. Scattered cattle were just a loss of time and labor, a message delivered in the language of inconvenience. He stood at the gap looking at the cut wire and the chewed-up ground where the cattle had gone through, and his expression when he came back to the house was the expression of a man keeping his temper in a very small space. 3 sections, he told Everett. East line around the survey marker. He set the fence pliers on the kitchen table, with a care that suggested he was choosing that over other options. Cut clean. This wasn't deer. Everett looked at the pliers. He looked at the eastern field through the kitchen window. He thought about what the eastern field represented, the 40 acres Blackwell had tried to steal on paper, the survey marker Mara had dug up out of the dirt, the ground that Price had certified. "He's reminding us he can reach the property," Mara said from the table. She hadn't looked up from her work. "And he's tying up your time. Scattered cattle take a full day to round up, maybe more. I know what he's doing. He's also testing your patience." She looked up now, seeing if you'll do something reactive that he can use against you. Everett picked up the fence pliers. "I'm going to fix the fence and round up the cattle." "Good." She went back to her writing. "Don't do anything else." He spent the day on it himself, and Holt and Pete Halloran, who showed up mid-morning without being called, apparently having heard about the fence from some network of information that moved through that farming community faster than Everett had realized. They fixed the wire and tracked the scattered cattle across 2 miles of open range and got most of them back by evening, missing 3 that had gone into a dry creek draw and would need another day to find. Pete rode alongside Everett during the afternoon push, and they didn't talk much, but at one point Pete said, quietly, "Greer did it. I saw his horse tracks at the gap. I know that horse. It throws its right front slightly, leaves a distinctive print. Can you prove it in court? Probably not." A pause. "But I know." "Then we know," Everett said, "and we wait." Pete looked at him sideways. "You're better at waiting than you look." "I've had practice." They pushed the cattle back through the repaired gap as the sun was going down, and Everett stood at the fence line in the orange evening light and thought about patience. About the kind of patience Blackwell had, the long, organized patience of a man who planned years ahead, and about the different kind of patience that came from having run out of alternatives and deciding to stand still and let the thing come to you. He wasn't sure which kind he had. He suspected a mixture. Saturday brought 2 things, in close succession. The first was a visitor Everett didn't expect, Sheriff Dan Cooley, arriving alone, without deputies, driving his own horse rather than the official wagon. He came to the front gate and stopped there and called out, which was a courtesy that distinguished the visit from official business. Everett went to the gate. Mara came to the porch and stood there watching. "I'm not here officially," Cooley said. He was a big man, and he sat his horse with the uncomfortable posture of someone who'd been doing something difficult for a while and was getting tired of it. I want you to know that. All right, Everett said. Cooley looked at him steadily. I knew about the land transfers, he said. Not all of it. Not the judge, I didn't know about that. But the county filings, the default notices. I knew they weren't always right. His jaw moved. Blackwell told me it was a technicality, a legitimate interpretation of debt law that the families should have understood. He stopped. I told myself that. Everett waited. The Halloran family, Cooley said. I've known James Halloran 20 years. He helped me move my family into this county when I first arrived. His voice was flat, but what was under it wasn't. I signed the paper that transferred his land. You didn't write it. No, but I signed it. He looked past Everett toward the porch, toward Mara. What she put together, the summary, the documentation. Nora Bellamy showed my wife a copy. My wife showed me. He was quiet for a moment. I can't undo what I signed. But I can tell you that when Harlan gets here, I'll cooperate with whatever he needs from the county records office. Fully. Everett looked at him for a long moment. That'll matter, he said. To the families, I know it won't fix it. Cooley picked up his reins. I just wanted you to know where I stood, before things move fast. He looked at the road. They're going to move fast. He rode away, and Everett went back to the porch, and Mara watched him come up the steps with an expression that asked the question before he could answer it. Cooley's going to cooperate with Harlan, he said. She absorbed that. Blackwell's losing his county cover, she said slowly. One piece of it, anyway. That's significant. She looked at the road where Cooley had gone. He must have known for a while. The decision to come here wasn't easy for him. No. Does that change anything for you? That he knew? Everett thought about it honestly. It makes me tired, he said. The same way it's tiring to find out something you suspected was true. He looked at her. It doesn't change the work. No, she agreed. It doesn't change the work. The second thing Saturday brought was Webb Greer, and Greer didn't come to the gate. He came to the back of the property, on foot, in the middle of the afternoon, while Everett was in the barn, and Holt was repairing equipment in the side yard. Mara was alone in the house. She was at the work table when she heard the back door not open, just tried the distinct sound of a handle turning against a bolt, and she was up and away from the table before she'd consciously decided to move. She went to the front room, where Everett's second rifle was racked on the wall. She'd looked at it every day for 2 weeks, and thought, abstractly, that she should probably know how to use it. She took it down now, which was less abstract, and went back to the kitchen doorway and waited. The sound at the back door stopped, a long silence. Then footsteps on the back porch, moving toward the side of the house. Mara went to the front door and opened it, and stepped out onto the porch and called across the yard, Holt. Holt looked up from the equipment. She held up the rifle, which communicated the situation without requiring additional words. He was up and moving toward the back of the house before she'd lowered it. She heard voices, Holt's, short and firm, and another voice she didn't know, and then footsteps going away. And then Holt came around the side of the house, with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral. Webb Greer, he said. Said he was checking a fence line. There's no fence line behind the house. That's what I told him. Holt looked at the rifle in her hands. He say anything to you? He didn't get the chance. She looked at the rifle, which she was still holding correctly for someone who'd never handled one before, which surprised her. Is he gone? Riding south. Holt watched her for a moment. You all right? Yes, she was. She examined that fact with some interest she'd expected to be shaking, and she wasn't, which told her something about what the past 2 weeks had changed in her. I'm all right. She went back inside and put the rifle on the table within reach and went back to work. When Everett came in from the barn and Holt told him what had happened, Everett stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Mara at the work table and at the rifle beside her, and he didn't say anything for a moment. He wasn't trying to break in, Mara said, without looking up. He wanted me to know he could get to the back of the house. Same as the fence, same message. You handled it. Holt handled it. I just made some noise. You took the rifle down. She looked up at him then. It seemed like the appropriate response. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was learning to read, not quite a smile, more the internal equivalent of one, the kind of thing that happened in the eyes rather than the mouth. You've never handled a rifle. It turns out the principle is fairly intuitive. He came the rest of the way into the kitchen. After this is over, I'll show you properly. After this is over, she said, I may take you up on that. She went back to her work, and he went to make coffee, and neither of them said anything else about it. But the conversation stayed in the room, in the particular way that certain conversations did, present without needing to be referenced again. Elias Harlan arrived on Wednesday. He didn't send word ahead. He rode into the county on Tuesday night and stayed at the Millhaven Express office, which was federal property, and therefore outside Sheriff Cooley's jurisdiction. And the first anyone knew of his arrival was Wednesday morning, when his federal deputies were seen riding toward the county seat with the particular unhurried efficiency of men who'd been given clear instructions and intended to follow them. Everett heard from Pete Halloran, who heard from Clara, who worked at the dry goods 2 buildings from the county office. By the time Harlan's man arrived at Everett's gate, Everett had been expecting him for 3 hours. The man's name was Deacon, a deputy marshal with a lean, weathered face and the posture of someone who'd spent more of his life on horseback than off it. He delivered a formal request, not a summons. A request, which was a distinction Harlan apparently considered important for Miss Mara Whitlock to present her evidence to the marshal at the county land office at 10 o'clock the following morning. "Tell him we'll be there," Mara said. Deacon looked at her with the evaluating expression of someone taking a first measurement. "You're Miss Whitlock, yes. Marshal Harlan says to tell you," he paused, like he was making sure he had the phrasing right, "that he's read your summary document twice, and he has no significant questions about the accuracy of the financial analysis. His questions are procedural." Mara received this without visible reaction. "Tell him I understand." Deacon rode back toward town, and Mara went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a full minute, which was unusual. "Procedural questions," she said finally. "Meaning he believes the financial analysis," Everett said. "Meaning he needed to say that, in the way he said it, so that I'd walk into that room tomorrow, understanding the evidence isn't what's in question." She looked at her hands. "He's telling me what the fight is going to be about. Blackwell's going to attack your credibility. He's been attacking my credibility since the day he filed the theft charge. Tomorrow Harlan's going to have to watch him do it in person and decide what he thinks." She paused. "I've never met Harlan. He's not going to be easy," Everett said honestly. "He's not going to offer you comfort or tell you what you want to hear. I don't need comfort. I need a fair hearing. You'll get that. Whatever else Harlan is, he's fair." She nodded slowly. "All right." She looked at the organized documents on the table, weeks of work, 12 separate files, cross-indexed and annotated and prepared for exactly this moment. "I'm going to read through everything tonight. You know it already." "I know it. I want to know it again." She pulled the first file toward her. "Go to sleep, Everett. One of us should." He looked at her, this woman, at his kitchen table at 8 o'clock in the evening, ink on her fingers, working through documents she'd already memorized, preparing for a fight that was going to happen in a room where powerful men would try to dismiss everything she'd built. The lamp made warm light across the table and across the side of her face and across the careful stacks of paper that represented 9 months of quiet courage he hadn't been present for. He went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. The county land office was a square, unremarkable room with a long table, 8 chairs, and windows that let in flat morning light. When Everett and Mara arrived at 9:45, Harlan was already there, seated at the head of the table with 2 deputies and a clerk. He was a lean man in his mid-50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who'd learned that most rooms became quieter when he stopped moving. He looked at Mara when she came through the door with the same direct, measuring attention he probably gave everything. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Marshal Harlan." She set her document case on the table without waiting to be invited, which seemed to register with him not negatively, just registered. "Where would you like to start?" "The judge payment," he said. "That's the piece with federal implications. Everything else is county fraud significant, but county. A sitting territorial judge receiving payment from a party with active cases before his court is mine. Page 4 of the summary," she said, opening the case. Cross-referenced to ledger entry dated March 2nd of last year, with the corresponding bank record copy on the following page. He took the documents she slid across the table and looked at them without hurry. One of his deputies leaned in. Harlan's clerk began writing. They were 30 minutes into the review when the door opened and Blackwell came in. He hadn't been invited, which everyone in the room knew and which he seemed to consider irrelevant. He was dressed carefully, hat in hand, and he brought with him a lawyer Mara had seen once, before a man named Aldous from the territorial capital, expensive in the specific way of lawyers who rarely lost. Marshal Harlan, Blackwell said. I believe there's been a serious misrepresentation brought to your attention. I'd like the opportunity to address it. Harlan looked at him with the expression of someone who'd expected this and found it neither surprising nor welcome. Mr. Blackwell, you weren't requested here. I'm aware. I came as a courtesy. Blackwell settled into a chair without being invited, and Aldous sat beside him, opening a leather case. Whatever documents you've been presented with were either fabricated by a disgruntled former employee or obtained through criminal trespass. In either case, they're not legally admissible and they're not accurate. Harlan looked at Blackwell for a moment. Then he looked at the documents in front of him. Then he looked at Mara. Miss Whitlock, he said, the ledger I've been given, the private one you maintained separately. Walk me through the first entry you considered suspicious. Don't summarize it. Walk through it. Blackwell's lawyer started to speak. Harlan held up one hand without looking at him, and Aldous stopped. Mara leaned forward slightly. August 14th of last year. I was reconciling the monthly accounts and noticed a discrepancy in the operating expenses column. Blackwell's notation read administrative coordination fee, which he'd used before for legitimate county filing costs. The amount was $40. She spoke evenly, precisely, as though reciting something she could see written in front of her. The problem was the timing. It was paid to a county official 3 days before the Peterson default notice was filed. I knew the Petersons were behind on a note. I'd processed the original loan documentation, but the amount they owed didn't match the default notice amount. The default claimed a larger sum. She paused. So I went back and looked at the original loan document, and the original loan document said one figure, and the default notice said a different figure. Different how? Harlan asked. The default claimed they owed $60 more than the original loan ever authorized. She met his eyes. I made a note of it. I didn't know what it meant yet. I just knew it was wrong. Harlan wrote something. His clerk wrote something. The room was very quiet. The $40 payment, Harlan said. You believe it was paid to facilitate the filing of an incorrect default notice. I believe it was paid to a county official who then processed a false default notice without examining the underlying loan documents. She reached into her case. The original Peterson loan document is here. Gerald Peterson kept his copy. The figures match what I recorded. The default notice figures don't match either document. Harlan looked at both papers side by side. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Blackwell said, she could have altered the loan documents. Mr. Blackwell. Harlan's voice was level. You'll have an opportunity to speak. This isn't it. Blackwell closed his mouth. They went through it entry by entry, Harlan asking questions, Mara answering them, her documentation present for every single claim. The Halloran transfer, the survey boundary, the judge payment, twice, once from the ledger, once from the copied bank record, and Harlan put both on the table and looked at them together for a long time. At one point he asked, the original bank record is still in Blackwell's office? It was as of the night I copied it, Mara said. Unless he's moved it. Harlan looked at his deputy. Deacon, sir, take 2 men to the bank. Now. Full inventory of the private office records. He looked at Blackwell. You will not interfere with that. Blackwell looked at Aldous. Aldous looked at the table. Something moved between them that was the legal equivalent of a man realizing he was standing on ice that had just begun to crack. Marshal Aldous said carefully, on what authority? Federal investigation of a bribery complaint involving a territorial officer, Harlan said. That's my authority. It's quite sufficient. He looked at Deacon again. Go. Deacon left with 2 deputies. Blackwell watched him go, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, his face shot something that qualified as feeling not fear, not quite, but the recognition that the situation had just moved past his ability to shape it. He looked at Mara. You understand, he said, his voice still controlled, that nothing you've done here is going to hold up. You're an accused thief. Your evidence comes from a woman with a motive to fabricate. My evidence comes from a woman who kept records, Mara said. The same records you hired me to keep. The only difference is that I kept mine honestly and kept a separate copy when I realized yours weren't. You broke into my bank. I've never said otherwise about the Saturday visit. But my ledger is mine. I wrote it. I kept it. And it documents 9 months of what I observed in your accounts, in your own notation system, using the same categorization structure you trained me to use. She looked at him steadily. You made me very good at this, Mr. Blackwell. That was your mistake. Harlan watched this exchange without intervening. When it ended, he looked at Blackwell with the expression of a man who had just seen something clarifying. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, "I'd like to ask you about Judge Wills." Blackwell's lawyer put a hand on his arm. "Marshall, my client." "Your client can answer the question or decline to answer the question," Harlan said. "But I'll tell you that I have a documented payment from his accounts to a sitting territorial judge, dated and cross-referenced, and the judge in question has already been contacted by my office and has requested a meeting." He let that sit for a moment. "So your client's answer will either help clarify the context of that payment or it won't. It's entirely his choice." Blackwell said nothing. Harlan nodded slowly, as if this were also an answer. "All right," he said. He stood up, which signaled something to his remaining deputy, who began collecting documents. "Miss Whitlock, I need you to remain available in this county for the next 2 to 3 weeks. You're a material witness in a federal investigation. Do you have a secure location?" "Callahan's ranch," she said. Harlan looked at Everett, who was sitting against the wall and had been since the meeting started. "Mr. Callahan." "She's welcome," Everett said. Harlan looked between them and made no comment on it. "Good." He picked up his own papers. "Mr. Blackwell, you'll surrender your passport and travel documents to Deputy D. Crane at the county office by end of business today. You're not to leave the territory." Blackwell stood up. His lawyer stood up beside him. "This is premature," Aldous said. "The evidence is circumstantial and the chain of custody for the copied documents is going to become irrelevant," Harlan said, "when we have the originals from the bank." He looked at Aldous without hostility and without warmth. "I've been doing this for 22 years. I'm familiar with the arguments." He picked up his hat. "Good morning, gentlemen." Blackwell walked out. Aldous walked behind him, already talking quietly into his ear, and whatever he was saying made Blackwell's jaw go tight. The room emptied out around Mara until it was just her and Everett and Harlan, who was putting on his coat with the methodical pace of a man who thought while he moved. "Your documentation is thorough," he said to Mara, not looking up. "Unusually so. I had a long time to be afraid," she said. "Fear makes you careful." Harlan looked at her then, directly. It was the look of a man who had spent decades measuring people and had developed reliable instincts about what the measurements meant. "It does," he said. "In some people," he picked up his case. "In others, it just makes them small." He went out, and the door closed, and the room was quiet. Everett came away from the wall and stood beside Mara, who was still at the table with her documents spread in front of her. She hadn't started collecting them yet. She was looking at the middle distance with an expression he couldn't entirely read, not relief, not triumph, something more complicated. The look of a person who had held a thing together with sheer effort for a very long time and was only now beginning to register what that effort had cost. "He's going to get the original records," she said. "Yes. And Wills is already talking to his office. If the judge is cooperating, Blackwell loses the protection of the court," Everett said. "He loses the county clerk too, probably. When one layer goes, the others follow." She nodded slowly. "It's going to take months," she said. "The actual legal process. Hearings, depositions, the property reversals. It's not going to be over quickly." "No. The families need to know that. The Hallorans, the Petersons, they need to know this isn't finished in a week. They know. They've been waiting this long." He looked at her. "So have you?" She looked down at the documents and began stacking them with the automatic, organized movements of long habit corners aligned, files in order, everything back in the case the way it had come out. When the case was closed, she put her hands on top of it and sat there for a moment. "I thought about what you asked me," she said. "When you asked what I'd want to do after this. I remember. Something of my own." She looked up. "I know what it is now. A document service. For ranching families. Helping people understand contracts and land records before they sign them, before someone can use the paperwork against them." She paused. "Nora said she'd go in with me if I set it up. She knows everyone in the county, and she's a small, genuine smile, considerably more sociable than I am." "It's a good idea," Everett said. "It's a necessary idea," she corrected. Blackwell found a gap in what people understood about their own paperwork and walked an entire scheme through it. That gap still exists, even after he's gone. She ran one hand along the edge of the document case. "Someone should close it." "Someone should," he agreed. He looked at her with that quiet internal expression she'd learned to recognize. "You going to have time for all of that?" "I'll make time. You're already working 12 hours a day. I work well." "I know you do." He picked up the document case and held it out to her. "Come on. Holt's got dinner started. We've got 3 cattle still loose in the east draw. She took the case and stood up. The afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle, and the room looked less official now, just a room with a table and some chairs, the formal weight of the morning already lifting. "Everett," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you for believing me," she said. "That first night. Before you had any reason to." He thought about the woman on his porch with one boot and a broken rib, and the particular kind of terror in her eyes that isn't the terror of someone making something up. He thought about what it had cost her to say, "Please don't send me back to a stranger in the dark." "You weren't asking me to believe you," he said. "You were asking me not to close the door." He looked at her steadily. That one was easier. She held his for a moment, and then she nodded, and they walked out of the county land office into the flat, bright afternoon, and the door closed behind them. And somewhere across town, Webb Greer was learning that federal deputies were in Blackwell's bank. And somewhere down the road, Silas Blackwell was sitting in a carriage with a lawyer telling him what came next. And somewhere to the north, Elias Harlan was walking toward that bank with the patient, purposeful stride of a man who had the authority to open every drawer in the place and intended to use it. The thing that had started with one woman on one porch on one midnight was spreading outward now, in all directions, the way a stone dropped in still. Water sends rings to edges you can't see from where you're standing. And none of it was going to be simple. None of it was going to be fast. But it was moving, and it was real. And it had the weight of the truth behind it, which was the only kind of weight that didn't eventually exhaust the person carrying it. It took 4 months. That was the part nobody told you when you set something like this in motion, not the dramatic confrontation, not the moment the marshal walked into the bank, not even the arrest. Those things happened, and they mattered, but they were over quickly. What came after was the long, grinding, unglamorous work of the legal process, and that took 4 months of depositions and hearings and document reviews and testimony sessions in rooms that smelled like old wood and lamp oil. And it asked more of the people involved than the confrontation ever had. Harlan's deputies found the original master ledger exactly where Mara said it would be, bottom drawer, left side, green leather binding. They found 3 additional ledgers she hadn't known about, going back 11 years, which expanded the scope of the investigation considerably beyond what any of them had originally mapped. They found correspondence between Blackwell and Judge Wills that was specific enough to make Aldous, when he reviewed the copies, go quiet in a way that his clients never found reassuring. Wills cooperated within the week. He was 63 years old and had a daughter in the territorial capital and grandchildren he was apparently more attached to than his loyalty to Silas Blackwell. And when Harlan's office made clear what the alternative looked like, he chose his grandchildren. His testimony added 2 additional county officials to the investigation: the county clerk, whose name had appeared in Mara's ledger 7 times, and a deputy land registrar who turned out to have processed nearly all of the fraudulent transfers. Blackwell was arrested on a Thursday morning in September, 6 weeks after Harlan arrived in the county. He was arrested at his own bank, which had a certain logic to it that the families found satisfying even if Mara was too tired by that point to feel much beyond relief. Aldous entered a formal defense that took another 8 weeks to collapse under the weight of the documentation, the judge's testimony, and the original ledger records that turned out to be even more damning than the copies Mara had made. She testified 4 times. The first time was the hardest, not because she didn't know the material, but because Aldous spent 2 hours trying every angle he had on her credibility, her motives, her character, her size, and her gender, and her unmarried status, all dressed in legal language but unmistakable underneath it for what it was. Harlan stopped the worst of it with the flat efficiency of a man who'd seen the tactic before and had limited patience for it. But he couldn't stop all of it, and Mara sat through what he couldn't stop with her hands still, and her voice level, and her answers precise. And when she walked out of that room, she went directly to the livery, where Everett was waiting with the horses, and she sat on a hay bale and didn't speak for about 10 minutes. He didn't try to fill the silence. He'd learned, over the months, that her silences were working silences she was processing, organizing, putting things back in order and interrupting them, was like jostling someone's arm while they were writing. "He called me a woman of low character," she said finally. "I know, I heard. In front of Harlan, in front of the clerk, in front of the families." Her voice was controlled, but the control was effortful in a way it usually wasn't. He also said your documentation was fabricated, Everett said. Harlan didn't believe that one either. She looked at her hands. The ink stains were permanent, now faded but present, the particular mark of someone who'd spent months writing things that mattered. I know he didn't. I know the testimony held. I know it went well. She paused. It still sits on you. Someone saying those things. Even when you know they're wrong. Yes, Everett said. It does. She looked at him. He wasn't offering comfort or arguing her out of it, just confirming that it was true, that the thing she felt was real and reasonable and didn't require fixing. She'd come to value that about him more than most things. Second testimony next week, she said, and stood up. I know. I'll be ready. You'll be ready before the week's out, he said. You're always ready before you think you are. She picked up her coat. You're better at this than you let on. She said the same thing she'd said to him months ago, back when the ranch was the whole world they were navigating. He almost smiled, which was also the same as before. The property reversals were slower than the criminal proceedings, which nobody had fully anticipated, and which caused a particular kind of anguish for the families involved, knowing the fraud was proven, watching Blackwell's case collapse, and still not having their land back. The legal mechanism for reversing a recorded property transfer required a separate civil process, even when the criminal origin of the transfer was established. And that process moved at the speed of a county court, working through a backlog of complicated cases with a newly appointed judge who was being careful because he was new, and because the last judge's conduct had made everyone careful. James Halloran didn't see his land returned. He died in November, 2 months before the Halloran transfer was officially reversed. He died in his own house, in his own bed, which he had not lost, and Pete was there and Clara was there. And by the time he went, he knew because Harlan had told Pete directly, which was a courtesy Mara had specifically asked the marshal to extend that the reversal was coming, that the record would show it wasn't his fault, that the signature on the default notice would be formally declared a forgery in a territorial court document that would exist as long as paper existed. He knew. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the land under his feet, which he'd wanted. But it was the truth, officially stated. And for a man who'd spent a year and a half wondering if he'd failed his family through his own carelessness, it was not nothing. Mara went to the funeral. She stood at the back, not wanting to take space that belonged to family, and Clara Halloran saw her and came to her and took her hand and held it without saying anything. They stood that way for a while, two women with nothing useful to say to each other, and no need to say it. The Halloran land came back to Pete in January. He rode out to it on the first morning he could and stood at the edge of the eastern pasture, the piece that had been fraudulently transferred, the piece that had started this whole unraveling and stayed there for a long time. He told Mara about it afterward, sitting in the small office she'd set up by then, and his voice did something complicated in the middle of the telling, and he stopped and pressed his lips together and started again. My father plowed that field, Pete said, before I was born. He used to say the soil there was better than anywhere else on the property. Something about the way it drained. He looked at the window. I'm going to plant it in spring. That's good, Mara said. He'd have liked knowing that. He knew you'd plant it. Pete looked at her. Yeah, he said quietly. I think he did. By December, 43 properties had been formally identified as fraudulently transferred through Blackwell's operation. Of those, 38 reversals were completed within 6 months of the criminal verdict. The remaining 5 involved complications deaths, subsequent sales, one property that had been subdivided that required additional legal work and took another year to fully resolve. Silas Blackwell was convicted on 11 counts of fraud, 3 counts of bribery of a territorial official, and 2 counts of falsification of public records. He received a sentence of 14 years in the territorial penitentiary. Aldis filed appeals that delayed the sentence by several months, but ultimately changed nothing. The county clerk received 3 years. The deputy land registrar received 18 months. Judge Wills, by virtue of his early cooperation, received a formal removal from the bench, disbarment, and a suspended sentence that required him to submit a public written statement detailing his role in the scheme, something Harlan had insisted on specifically, because he believed that the families who'd lost their land deserved to read, in the man's own words, exactly how it had happened. Mara read Wills's statement when it was published. She read it once and put it in the file she kept of all the official documents from the case, and she never read it again, because what she needed from it she'd gotten on the first reading, which was the simple, Official confirmation that the system had, eventually, worked. Not quickly, not without cost, not without James Halloran dying before he saw the end, but worked. She folded the statement into the file and closed it and put it on the shelf behind her desk. Webb Greer was charged with destruction of property for the fence cutting and with criminal trespass for the incident at the back of the ranch house. Charges that were minor compared to the rest of it, but that Mara had insisted on filing because she believed that the minor things mattered too. He received a $30 fine and 60 days in the county jail, which was not justice in any large sense but was something, and something was better than the nothing he'd expected to face. The office Mara and Nora opened was on the second floor of a building on the main street of town, above a dry goods operation, reached by a narrow staircase that made the space feel more private than it actually was. It had 2 windows, a large work table, 3 chairs for visitors, and a shelf that ran the length of one wall where Mara kept reference documents, territorial land law, standard contract language, loan documentation guides, survey regulations, things that any ranching family should have access to, and that almost none of them knew existed. Nora handled the people. She was constitutionally suited to it in a way Mara respected and didn't pretend to share. She remembered names. She asked the right questions. She made nervous farmers feel that their situation was manageable before they'd even sat down properly. Mara handled the documents, the analysis, the specific and technical explanations of what the paperwork actually said versus what someone was claiming it said. It worked because they were genuinely different, and because neither of them was trying to be the other one. Their first client was a widow named Dorothy Sims, who'd been presented with a loan renegotiation document by a new bank in the county and wasn't sure if she should sign it. Mara looked at the document for 20 minutes and found 2 clauses that would have, in certain circumstances, given the bank the right to accelerate the full loan balance with 30 days' notice. Not illegal, but not standard, and not something Dorothy Sims had been told about when the document was presented to her as routine paperwork. Dorothy Sims didn't sign the original document. She negotiated a revised version, with Mara's notes in hand, and the bank accepted the revision, because the alternative was a woman who knew what the clauses meant and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "You saved me a lot of trouble," Dorothy told Mara when the revised document was signed. "You saved yourself," Mara said. "You came in and asked instead of assuming it was fine." Dorothy looked at her. "Most people would have assumed." "That's the whole problem," Mara said. "That's what we're here for." Word moved through farming communities the way it always moved, slowly at first, and then suddenly everywhere. By spring they had more clients than they had hours in the day, and Mara began training a young woman named Frances, who'd been working in the county records office and had a natural aptitude for the work. Frances asked sharp questions and caught things quickly and had the particular quality that mattered most in this work. She didn't assume she understood a document until she'd read it twice. Mara was teaching her to read contract language one afternoon, line by line, the standard clauses and their implications, the places where legal language was designed to be reassuring while doing something else entirely. When Frances looked up from the document she was analyzing and said, "How did you learn all of this?" Mara thought about it. "The honest answer is that I learned it from a man who used it to hurt people," she said. "I learned how it worked by watching him work it." She paused. "Which is a complicated thing to be grateful for, but there it is." Frances considered this. "So now you use what he taught you against everything he built." "I use it to prevent the next version of him," Mara said. "There's always a next version." She went back to the document. Frances went back to her analysis. Outside the window, the main street of town was doing its ordinary afternoon business: wagons, horses, people going about the usual business of a Thursday. An ordinary day in a county that was slowly and imperfectly putting itself back together. Everett proposed in October, which was not a romantic month in any conventional sense. It was the tail end of cattle moving season, and he'd been up since 4 in the morning, and he smelled like a working ranch, and he had absolutely not planned to do it that evening. He'd had a loose plan involving something more considered, more arranged, and that plan had dissolved approximately 30 seconds after Mara came in from town and sat down at the kitchen table and took her boots off and exhaled in the particular way of someone who had used up everything they had and was glad to be home. The word home was what did it. He hadn't thought it consciously, but it was there when he looked at her, the idea that this woman at his kitchen table, in her stocking feet, rubbing the side of her left foot, where the old injury still bothered her occasionally, was the reason this house felt like a house again, rather than a place he was simply occupying between sleeps. He put a simple gold ring on the table in front of her. Not formally, not dramatically, he set it down the way you set down something you want someone to look at. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. Everett. I'm not asking you to stop working, he said. I'm not asking you to be different or to be here every hour or to organize yourself around what I need. You've built something that matters, and I'm not interested in pulling you away from it. He looked at her steadily. I'm asking if you want to share this with me, the ranch and whatever comes after it, as partners, equal ones. She looked at the ring on the table. She didn't pick it up immediately. She sat with the question the way she sat with all significant questions, turning it over, looking at its actual shape rather than the shape she might want it to have. I'm not easy, she said. I know, I work long hours and I bring the work home, and I'm going to keep doing both of those things. I know that too. And I want to change the filing system in the office, because your filing system is genuinely terrible, and it always has been. He almost smiled. It can be changed. She picked up the ring. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a moment, and something moved across her face that he'd only seen a few times, the unguarded version of her. The one that appeared when she'd stopped managing how she presented herself and was simply feeling what she felt. Yes, she said. Not dramatically. Just yes. The way she said things that she meant. He let out a breath he'd apparently been holding. Good, he said. She put the ring on and looked at it on her hand with a specific expression of someone taking an accurate inventory of an unfamiliar thing, and then she looked at him. I'm going to need to tell Nora, she said. She already knows I was planning to ask. Mara blinked. You told Nora before you told me? I needed to talk to someone, and you were the someone I was asking, so. He sat down across from her. She thought it was about time. Of course she did. But something in her voice was warm when she said it. She looked at the ring again, and then back at him. Everett. Yes. I'm glad you opened the door that night. He looked at her across the kitchen table. This table where they'd built a case and shared 100 meals and argued about filing systems, productive silence, and sat in productive silence, and had the kind of conversations that only happen between people who've stopped performing for each other. He thought about the midnight porch, and the one boot, and the woman on her knees who'd asked not to be sent back, and about every inch of ground between that moment and this one. So am I, he said. Every time I think about it, I'm glad. The ranch gate, which Everett had kept closed for 11 years, as a habit so ingrained he'd stopped noticing it, stood open now. It wasn't a symbolic choice, it was a practical one, because there were too many people coming and going to make the gate worth closing. Families stopped by. Pete Halloran came to consult with Everett about the eastern pasture planting and stayed for dinner. Nora arrived most Wednesdays with news from town and opinions about everything. August Price came occasionally with his instruments and his quiet company, and a surveying question for Mara that turned into a 2-hour technical discussion she appeared to enjoy considerably more than most social interactions. Francis sometimes brought work questions that couldn't wait until morning. The Fowler brothers came by once to repair a stretch of fence as thanks for what Mara's testimony had done for their lease claim, and stayed to help with other repairs they noticed while they were there, and were fed lunch, and came back the following weekend for no particular reason, beyond the fact that the place had become somewhere they felt comfortable. Children ran across the grass, which was something Everett hadn't planned for, and found that he didn't mind. Mara came home each evening from the office in town, sometimes later than intended, frequently with ink on her hands and the slightly worn look of someone who'd given a full day to demanding work. She came home because she chose to, which was the only version of coming home that she'd ever been willing to accept, and Everett knew that, and never once treated it as anything other than what it was, a choice, renewed every day, that he took seriously and was grateful for. They were not a perfect household. They were two people with particular habits and strong opinions about certain things and occasional disagreements that required the kind of direct conversation neither of them particularly enjoyed having. Mara worked too late sometimes and skipped meals she should have eaten, and Everett went quiet in the ways that men went quiet when something was bothering them, and they hadn't yet figured out how to say it. She was occasionally impatient with people who hadn't prepared adequately for a meeting. He was occasionally too solitary when the ranch demanded it. They worked around each other and with each other in the specific, imperfect way of two people who have decided that the other person's presence in their life is worth the adjustment. The following autumn, on a Thursday afternoon in October, almost exactly a year after Everett had put that ring on the kitchen table, a young woman came through the door of Mara's office. She was maybe 22. She had a bruise along her left jawline that she'd tried to cover and hadn't fully managed. She was carrying a cloth bag that contained, from the look of it, everything she'd thought to grab on short notice. She stood in the doorway of the office, with the particular posture of someone who wasn't sure they had the right to enter and was trying to read the room before committing. Frances was at her desk and looked up and said, "Carefully, can we help you?" The young woman looked at Frances. She looked at the shelf of reference documents on the wall. She looked at Mara, who had come to the inner doorway when she heard the outer door open, and was standing there with a case file in one hand. "I don't know if," the young woman started. "I'm not sure this is the right kind of place." Mara looked at her for a moment. At the bag. At the bruise. At the posture, which she understood the geometry of better than most people, because she'd had that posture herself. She set the case file on Frances' desk. "Come in," she said. She moved to the small table by the window, 3 chairs, a surface for documents, and pulled out the chair that faced away from the door, so the young woman could sit without having her back to the room. "Sit down." She waited until the young woman had come in and set down her bag and lowered herself into the chair with the careful movements of someone who'd been hurt in more than the visible ways. "Start wherever you want to start," Mara said. "There's no wrong place." The young woman looked at her. Something in her expression, the tight, controlled fear of it, recognized something in Mara's, and that recognition seemed to be enough. "My name is Anna," she said. Mara said. "My name is Mara. I'm listening." And she was. Completely. With all the attention, she had the same attention she'd always had. The attention that had cost her so much and protected her when nothing else could. The attention that had seen what others missed in columns of figures and land records and forged signatures. She brought all of it to this young woman in this chair, and Frances quietly closed the outer door, and the office went private. There is a particular thing that happens when someone who has been genuinely seen by the world starts seeing others the same way. It doesn't redeem the suffering that preceded it. That's not how suffering works, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What it does is make use of it. It takes the knowledge that came from the hardest seasons and puts it to work in the service of someone who needs it now. Mara had spent years making herself quiet so that men would allow her to do her work. She'd made herself invisible so that she could keep her eyes open. She'd built skills in a system that tried to use those skills against her, and she'd survived it, and she'd fought her way back through it, not cleanly, not without help, not without a stranger opening a door in the middle of the night when he had every reasonable excuse not to. She knew what it meant to need that door open. She knew what it meant to be the person who opened it. These were not the same thing. One came from luck, and the other came from choice, and the choice was the one that mattered not because it erased the luck, but because it extended it. Because it meant the thing that had happened to her didn't just happen to her and stop. It kept moving forward, passed from hand to hand the way useful things get passed, the way knowledge travels, the way a community knits itself together, not from the absence of trouble, but from the specific response to it. Anna talked for 40 minutes. Her situation was complicated in the way that all real situations were complicated, not a clean story with a clear villain and an obvious path forward, but a tangle of financial dependence and legal paperwork she hadn't understood when she'd signed it, and a person in her life who understood that she hadn't understood it, and had used that specifically. Mara asked questions and took notes and did not rush her and did not tell her what to feel. When Anna finished, she looked at Mara with the slightly hollowed expression of someone who'd put down a weight they'd been carrying alone and wasn't sure yet how to stand without it. "Can you help me?" she asked. Mara looked at her notes. At the specific legal situation as Anna had described it. At the places where documentation could be found and used, and where the paperwork, if read correctly, told a different story than the one she'd been told it told. "Yes," she said. "Let's start with the documents you signed. Do you have copies?" Anna pulled them from the cloth bag. They got to work. Outside, the October afternoon was doing what October afternoons did in Montana, cooling fast and turning gold at the edges. The light going low and specific and generous in the way that short-season light sometimes was, as if making the most of what time it had. The main street below the office windows was busy with the end-of-week business of a small county town, ordinary and loud and full of the ordinary human noise of people getting through their days. And in the office, above the dry goods, a woman who had once been on her knees on a stranger's porch with one boot and nowhere left to run, sat across a table from another woman who needed someone to listen, and listened, and made notes, and knew what to look for. The world doesn't change all at once. It never has. It changes one open door at a time, one honest document, one person who decides that what was done to them is not going to be done to the next person if they have anything to say about it. Mara Whitlock had plenty to say, and she'd learned, finally, that saying it was exactly what she was here for.